Hey, this is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page, and I want to take a few minutes today to talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And this is an issue that affects, I would guess, probably most people in the world, both religious and non-religious. It affects most people either directly, having been married and perhaps divorced and remarried, or it affects people sometimes indirectly. That is, maybe a friend or a family member of theirs has been married and divorced and then thinking about remarriage or having been remarried. And there's a lot that is involved here that's very important to discuss. So I want to take just a few minutes today to talk about this. The Old Testament talks about it. But let's do this first. So the title of the video is Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage. So let's start with talking about marriage first. And obviously the Bible talks a great deal about that in both the Old and New Testaments. Of course, the Bible starts out there in Genesis chapter 2 with what we would call the institution of marriage. You have Adam and Eve being brought together by God, the woman being created for the man, because as Genesis 2, I believe it's verse 18 says, God saw that it was not good for man to be alone, so he created a helper that was comparable or suitable for man. And so God's design then in marriage is that a man marry a woman, and that those two, as Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 19, they remain together for life. When questioned about divorce, Jesus tells us in Matthew 19 about divorce, he said from the beginning it was not so. So this was never a part of God's will. However, in both Old and New Testaments, there are exceptions to that rule. One is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, where that issue is addressed under the Ten Commandments, under the law of Moses. And then in the pages of the New Testament, Jesus addresses it very specifically in both Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew 19. And there are parallel accounts to Matthew 19, Mark chapter 10, and also Luke chapter 16 and verse 18 are the parallel accounts. And there are some other passages in the New Testament that talk about marriage and divorce and remarriage. And so it's an important subject. Like I said, I would guess that most people, again, both religious people and non-religious people, in one way or another, either directly or indirectly, have been impacted by this subject. So we need to talk about it and know what the Bible says. So there in the beginning, again, Genesis chapter 2, we have the institution of marriage. Again, one man and one woman. And that is reiterated in the New Testament by Jesus, by Paul. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 talks about that. Peter talks about it in 1 Peter chapter 3. Paul talks about it in Ephesians chapter 5, Colossians chapter 3. So this subject comes up time and time again in both testaments, I guess. But here's the thing. While we have the institution recorded for us, God's original design and intent for marriage recorded for us in Genesis chapter 2, and that's repeated and confirmed by Jesus in Matthew chapter 19 and Mark chapter 10 as well, people today, humanity today is not under the law of Moses. We don't live under that jurisdiction anymore. That law was nailed to the cross. Good afternoon, Gene, watching from Vidalia, Louisiana. Well, thanks for watching today. And the others who are on here, appreciate you watching the video today. So we're not under that law. As Paul tells us in Ephesians 2 and verse 15 and Colossians chapter 2 and verse 14, that old law was nailed to the cross. The handwriting of commandments contained in ordinances was done away with. So we are not under the jurisdiction of the law of Moses. So really we could talk about it, but we really don't have to deal with what the law of Moses taught on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. You and I, everybody today, is under law to Christ. As 1 Corinthians 9:21 tells us that. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2 says that we are supposed to fulfill the law of Christ. So what is Christ's law on marriage, number one, and then talk about divorce, and then also remarriage? Well, obviously, his doctrine or his teaching on marriage is the same as God's. And it's recorded for us in Matthew 19. The Pharisees have come to Jesus with a question, and they say, well, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for just any cause? And literally reading there, for any reason whatsoever. And there were two primary thoughts among rabbis of Jesus' day. One was more conservative, one was more liberal. The more conservative approach, and they're associated with Jewish rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, and I don't remember which one was which, but anyway, the more conservative approach was the only reason for divorce and remarriage was for sexual reasons. A spouse had committed fornication against their spouse. Well, the one who had not committed fornication had the right to put away the spouse and then remarry. The more liberal approach was just what the Pharisees asked here in Matthew 19:3, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? So beginning in verse 4, Jesus reiterates what God initiated in the beginning. Matthew 19:4. Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said for that? And let me say this real quick. In terms of marriage and in the context of 21st century America, I've heard this argument a lot. And this is, I guess I'd say, way off the subject, but I'll just touch on it here. The point's been made. People have said, again, in our modern culture, that Jesus never addressed homosexuality. He addresses it right here. God made man and woman, and that's the institution of marriage. It doesn't matter what the Supreme Court of the United States says. It doesn't matter how people feel or what they want. God's design for marriage is a man and a woman, period. And there's no arguing with that. Okay, so Stephanie's making some comments here. Yeah, the schools of Hillel and Shammai. Shammai was conservative. Hillel was a liberal. So thank you for those comments. I couldn't remember which was which. But that just shows that even in Jesus' day and prior to that, there were differing views on why a person could get divorced and then remarried. So Jesus is pointing out here, from the beginning God made them male and female. For this reason shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and those two shall be one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. And then he makes this point at the end of verse 6. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. The King James there says, let not man put asunder, tear it apart, basically. So the point being here, marriage is God's institution. It's not man's. And therefore, man doesn't have the right to come up with a variety of reasons or any reason to break a marriage apart. But the Pharisees are asking a very specific question here. So we'll get to that question. So in terms of marriage, biblically, people who can get married are those obviously who have never been married, and they decide to get married to a man or a woman. But then also in Romans chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, Paul talks about a married couple and a spouse dies, that when that spouse dies, the other is free to remarry. So there's another group, I guess you would say, of people who have the right to be married. But then thirdly, and more specifically, and I would say the one that causes the most trouble and the one that there's the most debate over is what we're going to deal with here in Matthew 19. In the case of fornication, adultery, the person who's guilty of committing fornication does not have a right to remarry. They can be put away, but they do not have the right to remarry. But we'll get to that in just a minute. So let's think about, again, we've already thought about marriage. Let's think about divorce for just a minute. So from the beginning, divorce was not part of God's will. And that's what Jesus says here. He makes that statement in Matthew 19, verses 4 through 6, that what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. And so the Pharisees, in response to that, well, then why did Moses give this exception? And I mentioned that earlier. That exception is recorded for us in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Why did Moses give that commandment to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? And Jesus' response is interesting. Matthew 19, verse 8, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you. It was not a command. When you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, it's not a commandment. There was permission given. There was an allowance, let's say it that way, an allowance for divorce in a very specific case. But then Jesus makes the point even further at the end of Matthew 19 and verse 8, but from the beginning it was not so. So this has never been a part of God's design a part of God's intent for marriage that it end in divorce. So we know who can marry biblically. We know that divorce has never been a part of God's plan. It's never been a part of God's will. But when you get to Matthew 19, verse 9, and this is where a lot of controversy comes in with this particular verse. And I always read from the New King James Version in these videos. And here's one area where the New King James Version falls down. If you're looking at it, if you look at a King James Version or some other versions, and most of your modern versions are going to read this way, and I think it's wrong, and I know it's wrong. So Matthew 19:9 says, "And I say unto you, whosoever divorces his wife except for," and again, the New King James here uses the words sexual immorality. If you're looking at a King James or an American Standard Version, it'll say fornication. The Greek word is porneia, and it's specifically talking about the sexual act between a man and a woman. It's a very specific term here, the way it's being used. Sexual immorality is a much broader term, and we have to understand that. There are a lot of things that could be put under the umbrella of sexual immorality that wouldn't be the physical act between a man and a woman. So just thinking off the top of my head, looking at pornography, that's sexually immoral. It's not fornication, but it's a sexually immoral act. So we have to understand that in this text, when Jesus is saying this, he's being very specific. Whoever divorces his wife except for fornication. And then he says this, and marries another, commits adultery. So if I'm married and I decide to put away my wife because I'm just unhappy in the situation, and then I decide to go out and marry another person, Jesus says, commits adultery. In the King James there, if you look at a King James Version, it has that ETH ending, committeth adultery. And that's, the tense of this verb is extremely significant. This is a present tense verb in what's called, the Greek language has moods too. It's a present tense indicative mood. And when you're looking at the indicative mood in Greek, it's talking about the reality of an action, that it's really taking place. So if a person gets a divorce for some reason other than their spouse having a sexual relationship with another person, and then they marry someone else, they are committing adultery. They are in the process of committing adultery. And then he says, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. That is, the one who had been put away because they committed fornication. If they get remarried, they're committing adultery, and the person they are marrying is committing adultery. Now, again, I know that this particular subject causes a lot of problems, and this subject matter becomes emotional because, like I said, most people, both religious and non-religious, are affected by divorce, either directly or indirectly. So that's why this becomes such an emotional topic, because, well, I know somebody that's going through this, or my parents or my children are in this situation. One thing that we have to do when we're approaching any topic of the Bible is understand that God's truth is not determined by my emotional attachment to it. Truth isn't determined by my response to it. In other words, again, whether we're talking about divorce and remarriage or salvation or worship or anything, God's word's the standard, not my feelings, not what I want to be the truth. So in terms of marriage and divorce, Jesus is being very specific here. The one reason, and the word he uses there in verse 9 is except. So the exception to the rule, and of course the rule is one man, one woman, as long as they live. The exception to that rule is if your spouse commits fornication against you, you can put that spouse away. But that spouse is guilty of fornication. If you divorce for any reason other than that and remarry, Jesus says you are committing adultery. And that would be a literal translation of that phrase there in Matthew 19:9, committeth adultery or commits adultery. It's an ongoing sin. It's a present tense indicative mood verb. It's ongoing. And so that's extremely important. Now here's what here's what's interesting when you get into this subject. People will, and I've actually got a book in my library that I read, I think, about 2 years ago on this, where authors will try to, or people will try to put Matthew 19 and 1 Corinthians chapter 7 together. And here's what I mean by that. Matthew 19 is a very specific question being answered. Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for any cause? And so Jesus addresses that down through verse 9 there. And let me say this before I finish with Matthew 19. Jesus' teaching on this subject is so, I guess the word I would use would be restrictive. When you read Matthew 19:9, you have to look at the apostles, let me just turn back there real quick, the disciples' response to what Jesus has just said. And their response is recorded in verse 10. So he's just said, if you divorce your wife for any reason other than fornication and marry another, you are living in adultery. And so the disciples understand exactly what he's saying, and listen to their response. If such is the case with a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. Jesus' teaching on the subject of divorce and remarriage is tough, and it's hard, but it's authoritative, and the disciples grasp that this is a hard teaching. Maybe we shouldn't get married if it's going to be this tough. Well, you can get married, but you have to live according to God's standard and do things God's way. So people go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 to try to change what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19. And here's what they do. They go to 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 15, which this is what that verse says. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. So he's saying, so these people will say, well, see, Paul allows divorce for depart. If somebody just leaves, then the one who's left behind is free to remarry. So let's address that real quick for the next couple of minutes. When you open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, when you read the very first verse, you see that Paul is addressing a question that they had asked him. Now, concerning the things which you wrote to me, he says in verse 1, and he begins dealing with a very special or a very specific topic question that they had asked in the first 9 verses there. But then you get down to verse 10, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10, Paul says, now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. And so what he's saying here essentially is this is the same thing that Jesus taught. He says a wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, and what Paul does here by inspiration is he gives 2 options. If you have a couple and one departs, you have 2 options. Let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. So again, Paul reiterates what Jesus said, what God said from the beginning, that the design of marriage, God's intent for marriage is not separation. It's not divorce. From, again, Matthew 19, verse 4 or verse 6, from the beginning, it was not so. So when people try to use 1 Corinthians 7 to justify divorce and remarriage, that's not what Paul's teaching here. He's talking about a completely different subject than what Jesus was addressing there in Matthew chapter 19. So remember those 2 options in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 11. If somebody does depart, she can either remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And then he goes on to say, notice here 1 Corinthians 7 verse 12, he says, but to the rest I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe. So here's a Christian who's married a non-Christian, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. You can't get a divorce just because a Christian marries a non-Christian. Again, Jesus gave us the one exception for a divorce and remarriage in Matthew 19, and that's fornication. So let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. So again, a Christian can't divorce a non-Christian just because they married a non-Christian. That's not permissible. And then he makes this point in verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. In other words, they're set apart for each other. And that's what marriage does. When a man and a woman enter into the union of marriage, they are set apart for each other. That's what that word sanctified means. They're not for anybody else. They're for each other. So then he says this in verse 15. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. So if it were the case that a non-Christian left the Christian spouse, Paul's instruction by inspiration is, let them go. But Paul is not giving permission here for remarriage. And the reason we know that is because of the context. You have to go back to verse 11. Even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. There is no third option here in this instance of a separation or a divorce. You keep on going, and it's interesting to note the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 26. There was what Paul calls the present distress. There was something going on in Corinth at that time, and most people agree that it was probably some sort of persecution against Christianity. He's giving them inspired advice because of what they were currently going through. And he tells them, listen, if you're married, stay married. If you're not married, don't seek to get married. But if you do get married, you're not sinning. But he said the best thing for you to do right now is to stay where you are. Don't seek marriage. Don't seek a divorce, anything like that. So my point in going to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is to show that Paul is not giving an exception to what Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 19. But that's what a lot of people do with 1 Corinthians 7 to really to get around Jesus' law for divorce and remarriage. Again, Jesus is very specific there in Matthew chapter 19. That's dealing with 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I want to run back real quick to Matthew chapter 19 and look at this again. And then we're going to look at Matthew chapter 5 real quick after that. So who can get married? Well, obviously, those who have never been married, or someone whose spouse has died, they can remarry, according to Romans chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. But then also, in terms of divorce and remarriage, when you look at what Matthew 19 teaches, there's no conflict, there's no problem with 1 Corinthians 7, because again, they're talking about two completely different issues. What should be called the third group of those who can be married is those who have a spouse previously, and that spouse committed fornication. In other words, they had a sexual relationship with someone other than their mate. Well, they can then be put away, and that spouse who didn't commit fornication is permitted to remarry. But if that one who committed fornication does remarry, Jesus says very specifically they are committing adultery. And remember, that's a present tense indicative mood verb. It's an ongoing sin. So that's Matthew 19. Now, Matthew chapter 5 says something interesting about adultery. Adultery, when we see it there in Matthew chapter 19, is being applied. It's a relationship that exists, and it's applied to the marriage, the institution of marriage. But here in Matthew 5, Jesus says something interesting that just shows us the seriousness of these sins that Jesus addresses. Matthew 5:27, you've heard that it was said of old, you shall not commit adultery. Well, that's one of the 10 commandments. That's Exodus chapter 20 and verse 14. But Jesus makes this point in verse 28. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery in his heart. That's a pretty strong statement. But that's Jesus' teaching on it. So this goes further than just the physical act of fornication. Adultery can be committed in the mind. That's what Jesus says. You look at a woman to lust after her, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, you go down just a couple of verses in verse 31. He says, furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Well, that's what I mentioned earlier in the video. That's Deuteronomy chapter 24. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except fornication causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. And again, this is very specific. This is not, I'll just say it like this. This is not hard to understand. This is not a difficult passage. Matthew 19 is not a difficult passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is not a difficult passage. Here's the reason they become difficult. And it's what I was saying earlier. This becomes emotional for us. Again, maybe it's happened to us directly. Divorce, that is. Maybe a parent, maybe a child, maybe a sibling of ours has gone through a divorce, and they're divorcing for some reason other than fornication. And so we get emotionally involved in the discussion, and we want to make exceptions that God's word doesn't make. And I would say probably that's what a lot of people do with 1 Corinthians chapter 7, with what Paul said there in verse 15. They take that verse out of context, again, failing to remember what Paul said there just 4 verses earlier in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 11. If two people divorce just because, they have to either remain unmarried or be reconciled. That's it. That's not difficult to understand. It becomes difficult when we begin to think that, well, my parent, my child, they're good people, and there's no way that they can be wrong here. Well, we can be wrong. That's the thing. And again, that's why I went back to Matthew 19, verse 10. When the disciples of Christ heard his teaching on divorce and remarriage, they understood it to be so difficult, they said, maybe we shouldn't get married. Well, that's not the point he was making, and that's not the impression he was trying to leave. He was just making the point, here's the one exception. That's it. So, marriage, divorce, and remarriage. I've gone almost 30 minutes. I need to quit here. So let's wrap it up. We discussed the groups who biblically are permitted to marry. Those who have never been married, those whose spouses have died, and those who have put away their spouse because that spouse committed fornication. Any other marriage, if there's been a divorce for any reason other than fornication, other than a sexual relationship that results in a remarriage, that is an adulterous relationship. And Paul talks about that. A verse that I haven't mentioned yet is over in Colossians chapter 3. Beginning in verse 5, in Colossians 3 and verses 1 through 4, he's talked about seeking those things which are above. We've died and our lives are hid with Christ in God. And so he says, based upon that fact that now we are living as Christians, he says, put to death your members which are upon the earth. And the first thing he mentions there is fornication. Well, we've been addressing that issue. And you go down to Colossians 3 and verse 7, as he's talking about all these different sins, including fornication, he says, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. And that goes right along with what Jesus said in Matthew 19, that if you divorce for any reason other than fornication and marry again, you are committing adultery. So that's very, it's easy to understand. It's not hard to get. So I've got a couple comments here that I'd like to address real quick. One is, many a congregation is allowing sinfully married couples to place membership, teach classes, preach, and wait on the Lord's table. I've often wondered why, if that is why the church seems to be dying. God cannot bless sin. And that last statement, God cannot bless sin, is absolutely true. And here's the thing, if you are dealing with this issue of divorce and remarriage for a reason other than fornication, it is sinful. It would be like John the Baptist told Herod, it's not lawful for you to have her. Some marriages are not lawful, and we need to understand that. Here's another comment. Reading the scriptures, I'm under the impression that Jesus was condemning the putting away of a spouse. Jewish men were putting away their wives without a bill of divorcement. These women couldn't remarry without the penalty of death for adultery, since they didn't have a bill of divorcement in hand. The Pharisees weren't testing Jesus on Deuteronomy 24 and what it says, and then there's a question mark. Well, that seems to be part of the question, because they brought that up. Well, Moses why then did Moses permit this and then command that a bill of divorcement be given? I'm turning back to Matthew chapter 19 here so I can read it accurately. But their original question was, going back up into verse 3, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And well, the answer to that is no. And well, then why did he command them to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? They're using that, saying, well, then why did he allow it to happen? Well, because of the hardness of their hearts, he permitted it. But again, as Jesus says there in verse 8, from the beginning it was not so. So that may have been the case, what you're saying there, that perhaps some weren't giving that certificate of divorce, and so then under that Jewish economy, well, that woman might be living in adultery because I don't see a bill of divorce. That's possibly the case, I guess. But Jesus is by at large answering that first question from verse 3 about divorce for any reason. From the beginning, it wasn't so. It's never been part of God's plan. And I'll say this too. I've known many people personally, relatives, who have gone through divorce, sometimes scriptural, sometimes unscriptural, for fornication, that is. And it's never good. It's never good. Now here's something that comes up too with a couple who you study with them, and I've been in this situation. You study with them, you find out, well, they've both been married before, and both of them, their previous marriages ended not because of fornication, just, well, hey, that first time I got married, I was young and I didn't understand it, and so we had a mutual separation. We decided to get divorced because we just weren't ready. Well, that's not the exception that Jesus gave. That's not permissible in God's eyes. It may be in the eyes of the state. You can get a divorce for any reason, irreconcilable differences. But in the eyes of God, that's not a reason for a divorce, and especially a reason for a remarriage. But here's what it goes. So you've got this couple, both have been married before. They're in a situation where their previous marriages ended in some reason other than fornication. Now they've married each other, and this is what happens. Well, we have children now, and if we break up, I don't think God would want us to break up this home with children in it. Well, here's the thing. The home that a person claims they have made is not recognized by God. And just having children does not, having a child does not change the fact that second marriage is the act of adultery. That's one of those emotional approaches to the subject. Well, I have children. Well, that's okay, you do. That doesn't sanctify an unscriptural marriage. It doesn't make it okay. Sin needs to be repented of. And, you think about any other sin, and I guess a common illustration would be talking about stealing. Well, so here's a question. Can a thief become a Christian? Sure. A thief can absolutely become a Christian. Can they keep stealing? Well, no. Can they keep what they've stolen before they became a Christian? Well, no. So apply those questions, apply that logic to marriage. Can a Christian continue to live in adultery and be okay? We wouldn't make that argument about any other sin, but, because children are involved, we want to make that type of argument. And here's another thing. If it is the case that that's what's going on, that you have an unscriptural marriage and you have children, what are you teaching those children by remaining in a sinful situation? You're teaching them that it's okay to defy the law of God. That's what you're teaching them to do. So, there are a lot of different directions that this discussion could go. But again, I'll say it like this. The Bible is very clear. The teaching of Jesus in Matthew 19 and the teaching of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 is not hard to understand. It becomes hard to understand when we get personally involved with it, maybe ourselves or, again, a loved one or a friend, and we want to make excuses for them, or we want to make exceptions for someone we love because we love them. Well, we need to be careful about that, because God's truth, the truth of a situation is not determined by my emotional response to it. So I know I've gone a little bit longer than I normally, about 10 or 15 minutes longer than I normally do. and I've got several on the live stream, and I appreciate you all so much for watching and commenting and asking questions, and I want people to always feel free to do that. But I'm going to wrap this up here. If you have any further questions on it or comments, you can comment on the video here, or you can send me a private message on Facebook to me or to the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. I'll be happy to address those things. But again, thanks for watching today. And as always, check out a couple different things on Facebook, the page nearchurches.com, and then a private group, We Talk Truth. You have to ask to join that private group, and once you do, we'll be happy to add you to it. There's a lot of good stuff that goes on in there. But thanks again for watching today, and I will see you on the next video.